area. Please help me to welcome Magnus Toren.
Hi. Do I need the microphone?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
You said yes. Okay, I'll use the microphone. So thank you for that introduction. It's very nice to be here in Carmel, and it scares me a little because I know that a lot of you people know stuff. Yeah, that's great. So because usually I'm able to lie a lot and nobody knows the difference. But tonight I have to be on my toes. How many of you maybe in this room actually knew? There's a possibility here that some of you knew Henry Miller, the author and artist. Yep, there we go. And obviously we know that Henry lived in Big Sur. He lived in Big Sur 1944 to 62. So the likelihood of some of you having met him is, it's there. But I want to start talking about myself. I came to the United States the first time in the in the winter of 1977, and in the spring of 1978 I was in New York City, and I had actually sailed from Sweden to the Caribbean and flew from the Caribbean up to New York City, and just to sort of see the American mainland. And to pick up my boat again in Panama. This is a long story, and I came to New York City, and in the city I met a young woman at I don't remember exactly where I met her, but somewhere in the city I met this young woman who we went to. No, in fact this is how it happened. I came to the airport. I'm flying from Bridgetown, Barbados, where I leave my boat, and I fly to New York City. I land in New York City on December 23rd. It's dark, it's cold, and I'm just coming from the tropics. And I have never been to the United States before. I have an accent, I'm from Sweden, and I had sailed from Sweden to Barbados in the Caribbean at the time, and I flew up to the United States to see this country. And I came to the airport, and I got off the airplane, and it's dark and it's cold, and I see a sign for the bus to Manhattan. It says, "Bus Manhattan, $5. And then a guy in a red beret comes up to me and he says, "Manhattan, my car, $7." And I said, wow, but I was a little apprehensive about going with a stranger, but I saw him solicit other people, and I thought, okay, why not? So I walked up to him and said, okay, I'll go with you. So he ended up in his car. I sit in the front seat. In the back seat are 3 black guys. And I'm from Sweden. I've hardly ever seen black guys. But they're sitting in the back seat there, and we're driving into Manhattan, and we drive uptown, and those 3 guys get left off wherever they're going, and the guy, his name is Steven, as it turns out, he says, "Where are you going?" I said, "I don't know where I'm going." And he said, "This is Manhattan, you need to know where you're going." and I said, "Well, I don't." So he kind of takes a little pity on me, I think, and he says, "Let's go have something to eat." So we go to a restaurant. I remember the name of the restaurant was Amy. And Amy's restaurant, they served pita bread with sprouts and melted cheese. And I remember sitting with Stephen eating pita bread with sprout and melted cheese, talking about the fact that I didn't know where to go and it was getting close to midnight. And he said, "Okay then, you can stay at my place." So we end up staying at his place on 74th Street and Broadway, Upper West Side. Before Upper West Side became what it now is, this was actually kind of a funky neighborhood, but really a fun neighborhood. I experienced it at the time. And his friend, a couple of nights, well, the next morning, we actually went out very short distance from his apartment there, took a walk out past on 72nd Street, And we passed the house, and he said, "That's where John Lennon lives." It was the Dakota, 72nd Street, and we walked across the Central Park West into the park where his buddies were playing softball. So that was my introduction to the United States. The second day I'm in the country, I'm playing softball in Central Park. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. So, but anyway, so back to the thing that I was trying to talk about, which was that a friend of his called a couple of days later and said, "A friend of mine from Monterey is coming for a visit. Do you want to come over and we'll go down in the village and we go to a party, or we go dancing or something?" And that's what happened. The friend of his from Monterey was a young woman, and we went out dancing and we got along really well, and she told me about her parents living in Monterey, California. So that's how I ended up coming to this place, because after New York I took a Greyhound bus and ended up in San Francisco, and then coming down the coast to this beautiful area. And now I'm kind of losing the why I started telling you all this, but I guess the point is that I fell in love with the area and ended up a few years later coming back to this area and to Monterey and to Big Sur. And the second time I came back to Big Sur, a young woman said, "Do you want to come to a party tonight at my place?" And I said yes. And that was Valentine Miller. And some of you, I'm sure, know Valentine Miller, Henry's daughter, right? Yeah. So back in 1984, I ended up being at a party on the hill on Partington Ridge at Valentine's house. A few months later, I met my wife-to-be in Big Sur, and got married in 1986. In those days, you see, it didn't matter so much whether you were a citizen or not when you got a job. At Ventana, the hotel in Big Sur, I went to the employment manager and said, "I would like a job." And she said, "Where would you like to work?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, what do you think?" And she said, came up with some suggestions. And then she said, "But then you need a social security number." And I said, "What is that?" And she said, "This is this, 7-digit number, and I can fill something in for you." And I said, "Okay, do that." I don't know if some of you may not think this is so funny, but that was back in 1984. So then I got a job at Ventana, and some years later, this extraordinary thing happened at the Henry Miller Memorial Library. In fact, when I left Sweden in 1977, remember I said that I was sailing and I came on a boat? The book that was on my bunk, on my boat, when I left Stockholm on August 11, 1977, it was actually a nice northerly breeze as we sailed out of Stockholm to sail around the world in this sailboat. The book that was on my bunk was The Colossus of Marusi by Henry Miller. So that is an extraordinary thing. You can sort of try to explain that 87, 97. But 15 years later, I end up doing the job as the director of the Henry Miller Memorial Library. You know what? I'm so nervous. I have to drink something. I'm glad I'm catching someone's attention. Well, that's another story. But the boat, actually, I end up coming back to the boat. Like I said, I ended up coming to Monterey, which I fell in love with. But I actually continued the journey. This is 1978 in the springtime, when I had been playing softball in Central Park. But I was on my way down to meet the boat again. And I did that in early May of 1978. And then we sailed on into the South Pacific and so on. But that's a different story, which incidentally I told in Carmel many, many years ago. Some of you may have been. I did some slideshows telling stories about my sailing adventures back then when I had come back from those. Where was I? Yeah, so extraordinary. I got the word from the person who was at the Henry Miller Library, a place which I had gone to several times to visit and talk to Emil White, the man who lived at the library, the man who actually created the library, the man that some of you, I'm sure, knew. Emil was a very, in some ways, gregarious and I'm sure a very friendly man to hang out with. He wasn't super friendly with me. The cliche about Emil White is that he was such a sort of sexist pig and he was always after women. And I think in some ways, maybe there was some truth to it, because I remember him being very kind of standoffish towards me, but if I had a female companion, he sort of completely came alive. So he kept on having that kind of a spirit within himself until he died at age 89. But I knew Emil, and I knew then after Emil was a man named Kamstra who took care of the library, and then someone that you all know, probably Chris Counts, who now works for the Carmel Pinecone, was the director of the library for a short while. I walked in there one day and I said, "Hey Chris, what's going on?" He said, "Well, I'm quitting." And I said, "Are you quitting this job?" And he said, "Yes, I'll do it." He said, "Okay." So I applied for the job, and then in 1993 since then is when I've been the director of the Henry Miller Memorial Library in Big Sur. I have to breathe. It's been an extraordinary time for me to do the library, and I'm sure some of you have heard, or some of you have, how many of you have actually been to the Henry Miller Memorial Library? Almost all of you, okay, good. How many of you felt that had a good experience when you walked? This is a very dangerous question. How many of you had a good experience going into the Henry Miller Library? Most, some of you, not all. How many of you had a bad experience coming into the Henry Miller Memorial Library? Now you can be honest. Okay, great. So, because the Henry Miller Memorial Library never has tried, the library has never tried to be anything other than sort of a casual stop on the road. And our motto at the library for the last 10 or so years has been a place where nothing happens. And of course that's a little bit of a contradiction, because you guys hear about the concerts and the events we have at the library, I'm sure. But ultimately those events are really a way to arriving at the point where we are going to be able to do nothing, which is the goal for us, or for me anyway. Can you imagine having a library where nothing happens? Could anything be better than that? That's sort of the goal, you know, where you're just going to hang out and read good books and sit and talk and not have any kind of stress about having to create a bunch of events. Not that I haven't liked and completely been amazed at the events that we've been able to create at the library. And some of you have probably heard of the theater and the music that we've had at the library. Some of the most well-known musical artists in fact in the world has played at the library in the last few years, which kind of is mind-boggling in a way. Just now, I was speaking to someone just now before I came up here on the podium about what's going on now, and right now we're going to have the Henry Miller Library go on a jaunt to Brooklyn, New York. Henry Miller was born in Yorkville, Upper Manhattan, but when he was 6 months old, the parents moved to what's now Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And he grew up the first 10 years of his life on 662 Driggs Avenue, Williamsburg. And lo and behold, in Williamsburg, just around the corner from 662 Driggs, is 370, it escapes me now the name of the street, but it's right there is a place called the Reliquary. And the Reliquary is a little museum. And this is this little museum that we're going to take over now in May, from May 12 through May 20, this spring, to do an exhibit of Henry Miller's stuff from the Henry Miller Memorial Library in Big Sur. And we call it the Big Sur Brooklyn Bridge. So if any one of you know of anyone who lives in Brooklyn or New York City, let them know about the Big Sur Brooklyn Bridge, because it's a week-long series of events culminating with a concert at the Brooklyn at the Williamsburg Music Hall with none less than actually it's going to be a concert with Philip Glass and Van Dyke Parks. I don't know if you guys know who either of those two guys are, but it's going to be an amazing culmination of a week's worth of events in Brooklyn. So that was tonight's PR piece. But it was brought to me by the thought of Henry growing up there, right there on 662 Driggs Avenue in Brooklyn. This is briefly what happens to Henry Miller when he grows up in Brooklyn is that the streets of Brooklyn are tough. It's a tough town to grow up in, and Henry has a sister who has mental challenges. She's what we call, I guess, I don't know if it's PC to say retarded, but basically she was retarded. She didn't get to a mental state over the age of probably about 8 or 9 maybe, if that makes sense. So Henry had fights in the neighborhood protecting his sister from people who were making fun of her or penalizing her in some ways. So it was a tough town in Williamsburg. Henry himself had a I think born with, I don't know Henry Miller, I never met him, but I have read about him and I've read what he has written, and I have a sense of his intensity. I have a sense of his not giving up. He would be the kind of guy who would run, maybe not in competition with others, but sort of just to prove it to himself. He would run himself into absolute exhaustion down the track. I mean, he would run and run and run until he absolutely fell down. That's the kind of character he had. He worked extremely hard. He would be in complete coma writing what he wrote, feeling that there was no other thing in the world than his effort and his act of writing at that moment. This is a kind of a personal characteristic of his that I think permeated and probably was one of the reasons why Henry Miller became a well-known and much appreciated, and of course much unappreciated at the same time, author. I'm sure many of you know that Henry Miller, the writer, was filled with his life, and especially his literature was very controversial. The first book that Henry Miller published was Tropic of Cancer, and the book Tropic of Cancer was published in Paris in 1934. And some of you have probably read Tropic of Cancer, and many of you have probably tried to read Tropic of Cancer and given up, who knows. But the book is nevertheless a hugely important book in the 20th century of literature, whether you like that or not. It was published in Paris in 1934, when in the wake of the lost generation, as we say, in the 20s, Paris was a very happy place, and Paris had Hemingway and other very well-known authors. The 30s was a whole different ballgame. This is after the Depression has struck. Paris is just like as bad as it is here. People don't have lots of employment, and money is not easy to come by. Henry lives in that environment in the 30s in Paris and survives from his wit and his ability to I think really get friends to pay for dinner. You know, I mean, if you know how to talk, and if you're a charming person, and you flatter somebody a little bit about how nice they look and how nice clothes they have, or whatever, and then maybe flatter them in terms of like, let's have a conversation about Stendhal. And people go, oh, how fantastic, let's do that. And Henry would do that, and they would have a lovely evening together. So what's wrong with that? That's what Henry did in the 30s. And a lot more than that, of course. But 1934 then, as you may have heard, of another person in Miller's life who is very well known is Anais Nin. How many of you have heard her name? Yeah, there we go. I mean, Anais Nin then was instrumental in making Henry Miller make it. Had it not been for her, who knows, but it's very likely, or I would say possible, that Henry would have just kind of slipped down, further down sort of Skid Row not been able to kind of pull himself up by the bootstraps. He certainly had a huge amount of energy and a very, very strong will. So it would have taken a lot, but he was at his wit's end almost at the time when he met Anais Nin. And she then eventually helped him to get his first book published. She basically went to the publisher and said, here, Mr. Jack Kahane, I mean Maurice Jordias, or Jack Kahane was his name at the time, Jack Kahane at Obelisk Press, he said, this is a fantastic book, you need to publish this book. And he said, I can't publish it, it's too controversial. And she said, well, here is some money, and you just go ahead and publish it. And he printed 1,000 copies, and it became a huge sensation overnight. And the rest of it is history for Henry Miller as far as being an author worth paying attention to. He didn't make a lot of money until much later, but this is the 1930s. It's a tough time. So 1930s, you know, he's in Paris, and he has published the one book, Tropic of Cancer. Then he writes some other books, few things here and there. He goes back and forth he actually travels to New York at that time too, but within the 30s in Paris, he publishes Tropic of Cancer, Black Spring, and Tropic of Capricorn, those 3 books, and a few other smaller books. But that sets him off as this writer that the world pays attention to at the time. And when the Second World War breaks out, Henry Miller takes off. He's actually in Greece at the time, visiting his friend Katsimbalis in Greece. And at the time of the war breaking out, the State Department tells Americans, even the ones that are in Greece, which is kind of far away from the conflict at the time, to consider taking their stuff and going back to the United States. So Henry does. He takes his belongings, which probably at the time isn't more than a suitcase of some clothes, and he gets on a boat and he goes all the way back to the United States and enters the United States in late 1939, and then travels the country in the 40s, and it's in 1944 that he ends up coming to Monterey and meeting with an artist named Gene Varda. Anybody recognize that name? Yeah. So Varda becomes a friend of Henry's here in Big Sur, and he takes him down the coast to Big Sur, where Henry says in a letter to a friend at the time, I have found paradise on earth, it's called Big Sur. This is where I'm going to live. And on the trip, incidentally, after he had come back from Europe, due to the fact that the Second World War breaks out, he travels to Chicago, and in Chicago, he's on a road trip with an artist named Abe Ratner at the time. And in Chicago, he meets a young man at a gallery named Emil White. And that name rings a bell with some of you, I'm sure. And Emil, at the time, strikes up an immediate friendship with Henry in this bookstore. And they continue to stay in touch with each other. And when Henry finds Big Sur, he writes Emil White a letter saying, Emil, I have found paradise. It's called Big Sur. You should pack your bags and come. And Emil at the time is actually up in the Yukon escaping the draft. Because So he finally gets the letter though from Henry, and he does pack his bags and comes down to Big Sur in late 1944. And like I said, some of you may very well remember his name. It is Emil White who created the Henry Miller Memorial Library out of his own home. And so, because he did pack his bag and come right away down to Henry to be with him and help him out with, as it were, correspondence mainly. Henry had a huge amount of correspondence, but that's what happens. They both live in Big Sur, and it took a few years for Henry to find his house on what ended up being on Partington Ridge in Big Sur. But that's what happens there. Are you falling asleep? Okay, just checking. What should I talk about now? The house in Big Sur, okay. The house in Big Sur is actually, it is a good thing to talk about. It's fascinating how things have changed, put it that way. There was a lady named Jean Wharton who lived on Partington Ridge and had this beautiful house, and she heard of Henry's plight of having all this energy and this literary ambition and so forth. And she said to herself, I should help this young man. I should give him my house. So that's what she does. She contacts him and says, hello, Henry, I hear you're working hard at your literary endeavors. I feel like helping you. Why don't you take my house? And Henry says, okay, fine. And then he ends up, and in the end he ends up paying her, I think it is $5,000 in total for the house overlooking the Pacific Ocean at about 1,000 feet above sea level. So not a bad place, and that is where Henry lives for the rest of his time in Big Sur. It turns out to be 18 years, and that is where he first has his actually kind of a mail order bride named June Lancaster. Do you want to hear a little bit of gossip about Henry? Yeah. Because Henry, some of you very much will know about Henry Miller through his sort of like the talk about sex. People insist on talking about sex around Henry, and of course there are some reasons for that. One is that the books that he published were very shocking at the time. Tropic of Cancer being one of them. They were, as you very well may know, banned in this country until 1964. So for 30 years, only Americans who were smart enough to smuggle them in could read them. Otherwise, they were banned. But
in France also.
In France also, exactly, yeah. But nowhere near as long in time. In fact, interesting, the first country where they were, or one of the countries in which it was readily available was Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, which then ended up being, of course, completely shut down by the Second World War. And not until 1991 or 1992 did these new editions of Henry's work come out on the other side of the Berlin Wall, which is an interesting fact. But where was that? Before that?
Gossip.
Pardon, what? The bride.
June.
Yes, June, right, yes.
We want the dirt.
Huh? You want the dirt, okay. Henry is living on Partington Ridge and is communicating with his friends and is he loves everything about it except there are no women. How can you survive without a woman? You know, so he's reaching out, and somebody then suggests to this June Lancaster is her name. She is a man down in Los Angeles who is kind of like a go-between and suggests that she come up. And Henry is in love with her already. And one of the reasons he's in love with her already is that her name is June. And some of you may know that Henry Miller's first very, 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 very intense love is June Mansfield. The June of Tropic of Cancer, the June of the book that I just spoke about being the first book that Henry Miller published. Tropic of Cancer being the book that has been selling in more than multiple millions of copies around the world since it was published. Tropic of Cancer, the one book that Henry is famous for more than any other book. June is the June of that book. And so this June was for Henry a second June. My gosh. So for him it was a fait accompli. This is like faith. This woman is already named June. She must be perfect. Just to rewind though, June, the woman that the first June is a woman he meets in New York in the 20s, in 1924. He meets her, and it's the two of them that conspire to together go to Paris in the 30s. They actually leave New York in the late 20s and end up having this kind of extraordinary love, cultural, strange experience in Paris in the early 30s that is depicted in some ways in a film made in Hollywood called Henry and June, that some of you may have seen. Uma Thurman the famous actress, is playing June, this sort of femme fatale who just kind of makes every man fall apart. That's June, played by Uma Thurman. Henry Miller is played by what's his name? Nobody knows this film? What's his name? Fred Ward. Thank you. Fred Ward plays Henry. Wow. Anyway, that actually is a film worth seeing, I think. It's called Henry and June. So, can you get me back on track now? Where was I? Second June, yeah. So we're in 1940, 44, 45 here in Big Sur. It's in 1944 that the second June comes in onto the stage. She comes up to Big Sur and stays for a very short time. Henry realizes that she didn't know about country life, so she was out kind of dancing ballet in the wood all day. Henry was waiting for dinner, and it didn't work for very long. These are the days where men would wait for dinner if they had a woman around. But then very shortly after that, he goes to Dartmouth on the East Coast on a trip and meets his next wife, which is Lepska Warren. And some of you may have known Lepska, is what I'm hoping. Lepska was the mother of Tony and Valentine. I'm sure that some of you in this audience would know or would have been acquainted with Tony and Valentine, Henry's two children in Big Sur. Their mother was Lepska. Henry met her in 1944 at Bryn Mawr up on the East Coast. She was a graduate of she was only 20 years old at the time, and Henry is in 1944, he is already 53. But in those days, Henry picks her up, and they have a long trip across the country, and they get married in Colorado on the way over, and end up living on Partington Ridge, having two children, Tony and Valentine. Some of you, I'm sure, know Tony and Valentine. And that's how that ends up happening. Pretty amazing how that relationship worked out. Now I'm getting completely lost here again. I have a hard time keeping track of where I am. Can someone help me?
Talk about the Oranges of Hieronymus Bosch.
Sure. Oranges of Hieronymus Bosch is Henry's book that can you imagine, those of you who know me, can you imagine that I'm standing here like being tongue-tied? Have you ever seen me being tongue-tied before? It's never happened. It's because I hate the microphone, actually. Yeah. Can I take it away, the microphone? Do you think you can hear me with that? No, you can. You can. I'm going to relax about it, and I'm going to say that I'm going to tap into my resources, which I have behind me. I'm wondering sometimes, you know, when you come to a talk about a literary figure in the area, people come with all kinds of preconceived notions about who that was and who that is. Does anyone want to share any kind of notion about Henry Miller that they may have, just as a point of discussion? I would love to hear. Does anyone have any, like, you came tonight thinking that you were going to find out what? Something like that. Yes, sir.
Well, most literary people have correspondence. With whom did Henry Miller correspond?
That's a great question. The most famous correspondence that has been published is his correspondence with Lawrence Durrell. Does that name ring a bell? Yeah. The Alexandria Quartet is his famous work. So that's the most famous correspondence. But Henry had, I mean, unbelievable correspondence. If you were to look at the amount of letters that he wrote, the amount of letters that he sent out to the world, it's absolutely astounding. None of us come anywhere close to that kind of amount of writing. He had like, I don't know, maybe 60 people that he constantly corresponded with. So in his mailbox on Partington Ridge, it's not an exaggeration that he actually had a big bag of mail that he would carry on this little track, that he would walk up the hill to his house.
And I was thinking of contemporary writers, for instance. Kenneth Rexroth, for instance?
He knew Rexroth. There's no correspondence between him and Rexroth that has survived or that has been published. In fact, he and Lepska, the woman that he finds at the Bryn Mawr, they stay at Rexroth's house when they first come to San Francisco before coming down the coast back in '44. So they were friends, but I don't know about correspondence. Henry never had any relationship with his nearest neighbor Steinbeck, which of course could have been something that could have happened. That didn't happen. There are many people in Henry's life that he had a correspondence with. I can't think of anybody particularly famous now, other than. Huh? For instance, yeah. So I'm going to read a piece of Henry's here. This is one of Henry's famous essays called Staff of Life. Is anyone familiar with that? He says, this is written around the time of coming to Big Sur, like 44, 45. He says, bread, prime symbol. Try and find a good loaf. You can travel 50,000 miles in America without once tasting a piece of good bread. Americans don't care about good bread. They are dying of inanition, but they go on eating bread without substance, bread without flavor, bread without vitamins, bread without life. Why? Because the very core of life is contaminated. If they knew what good bread was, they would have not have such wonderful machines on which they lavish all their time, energy, and affection. A plate of false teeth means much more to an American than a loaf of good bread. Here is the sequence. Poor bread, bad teeth, indigestion, constipation, halitosis, sexual starvation, disease and accidents, the operating table, artificial limbs, spectacles, baldness, kidney and bladder trouble, neurosis, psychosis, schizophrenia, war and famine. Start with the American loaf of bread, so beautifully wrapped in cellophane, and you end up on the scrap heap at 45. The only place to find a good loaf of bread is in the ghettos. Wherever there is a foreign quarter, there is apt to be good bread. Wherever there is a Jewish grocer or delicatessen, you're almost certain to find an excellent loaf of bread. The dark Russian bread, light in weight, found only rarely on this huge continent, is the best bread of all. No vitamins have been injected into it by laboratory specialists in conformance with the latest food regulations. The Russian just naturally likes good bread, because he also likes caviar and vodka and other good things. Americans are whiskey, gin, and beer drinkers who long ago lost their taste for food, and losing that, they have also lost their taste for life, for enjoyment, for good conversation, for everything worthwhile, to put it briefly. The care and affection which once was bestowed on the human body now goes to the machines. The machines get the best food, the best attention. Machines are expensive, human lives are cheap. Never in the history of the world was life cheaper than it is today, and no pyramids to show for it either. How natural then that the staff of life should be utterly without value. I begin with bread and I shall end with bread. I say, we make the foulest bread in all the world. We pass it off like fake diamonds. We advertise it and sterilize it and protect it from all the germs of life. We make a manure which we eat before we've had time to eliminate it. We not only have failed, I know, pretty bad. We not only have failed God, tricked nature, debased man, but we have cheated the birds of the air with our corrupt staff of life. Every time I fling the stale bread over the cliff, I beg forgiveness of the birds for offering them our American bread. Perhaps that's why they are not singing anymore, as they used to when I was a child. The birds are pining and drooping. It's not the war, for they have never participated in our carnages. It's the bread, the stale, flat, unprofitable bread of the second day. It shortens their wingspan, weakens their umbrella ribs, reduces the scope of their swoop, blunts their beaks, deteriorates their vision, and finally, it kills their song. If you don't believe me, ask any ornithologist. It's a known fact. And how Americans love facts. So that's from an essay that Henry calls The Staff of Life in Remember to Remember. A second volume, actually, of two books that together are known as The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, which are books that he wrote coming back to the United States. These are beginning then. So it's really essentially during the war years that he writes these things, before ending up in Big Sur in 44. It was fun to read. It's kind of a non sequitur here. I don't know if I should do this, but we talked about June before. June, of Henry and June, the film that Hollywood made with Uma Thurman. I just want to read this little snippet out of the Rosy Crucifixion. Volume 1 of that trilogy is called Sexist, and in it he talks about meeting this woman, June. This then would be in the 20s, something like 1923 in New York. And he says, Sunday morning, I awaken fresh as a daisy. The world lies before me, unconquered, unsullied, virgin as the Arctic zones. I swallow a little bismuth and chloride of lime to drive away the last leaden fumes of inertia. I will go directly to her home, ring the bell and walk in. Here I am, take me or stab me to death. Stab the heart, stab the brain, stab the lungs, the kidneys, the viscera, the eyes, the ears. If only one organ be left alive, you are doomed. Doomed to be mine forever, in this world and the next and all the worlds to come. I'm a desperado of love, a scalper, a slayer. I'm insatiable. I eat hair, dirty wax, dry blood clots, anything and everything you call yours. Show me your father with his kites, his racehorses, his free passes for the opera. I will eat them all, swallow them alive. Where is the chair you sit in? Where is your favorite comb, your toothbrush, your nail file? Trough them out, that I may devour them all in one gulp. That's a guy. He's totally head over heels in love with this lady, and her name then is June. And this is the June I talked about before. But just one more thing in Sexist here that he says, well, I was talking about Joey and Tony, my little friends. I was lying in the dark, a little twig floating in the Japanese current. I was getting back to simple abracadabra, the straw that makes bricks, the crude sketch, the temple which must take on flesh and blood and make itself manifest to all the world. I got up and put on a soft light. I felt calm and lucid, like a lotus opening up. No violent pacing back and forth, no tearing the hair out by the roots. I sank slowly into a chair by the table, and with a pencil I began to write. I described in simple words how it felt to take my mother's hand and walk across the sunlit fields. How it felt to see Joey and Tony rushing towards me with arms open, their faces beaming with joy. I put one brick upon another like an honest bricklayer. Something of a vertical nature was happening, not blades of grass shooting up, but something structural, something planned. I didn't strain myself to finish it. I stopped when I had said all I could. I read it over quietly, what I had written. I was so moved that the tears came to my eyes. It wasn't something to show an editor, it was something to put away in a drawer, to keep as a reminder of natural processes, as a promise of fulfillment. Every day we slaughter our finest impulses. That's why we get a heartache when we read those lines written by the hand of a master and recognize them as our own, as the tender shoots which we stifled because we lack the faith to believe in our own powers, our own criterion of truth and beauty. Every man, when he gets quiet, when he becomes desperately honest with himself, is capable of uttering profound truths. We all derive from the same source. There is no mystery about the origin of things. We are all part of creation, all kings, all poets, all musicians. We have only to open up, only to discover what is already there. What happened to me in writing about Joey and Tony was tantamount to revelation. It was revealed to me that I could say what I wanted to say if I thought of nothing else, if I concentrated upon that exclusively, and if I were willing to bear the consequences which a pure act always involves. Nice. So that's just from Sexist.
What does sexist mean? S-E-X-U-S?
I don't know what it means, actually. Sexist, nexus, and plexus. I mean, it's sort of words. I'm not sure. I just like this little section here out of... Uh-oh. So then this book here, Tropic of Cancer, is the American edition of this book that he published in Paris, the first book in 1934. I should mention that Miller, back at that time in Paris, really became a sensation overnight, that he became a very well-known writer very quickly after Tropic of Cancer was published. It didn't mean that he was like crawling out on a green branch and had no financial difficulties. It wasn't as easy as that, but he was very well known in the literary circles, basically the day after he published this book. And this particular book I'm holding in my hand is the American edition of Tropic of Cancer, which then was published after it became legal in this country in 1964. So for 30 years, it had been only imported by people who were breaking the law. And I think I'm not going to read any of those really nasty sections of the book, although I know that all of you want me to. But the fact is that they are nasty even by today's standards. Everybody thinks, oh, couldn't be anything compared to what's out there today. But in fact, I think it is. So now you're all going to want to read it. But the book. I want to read this famous passage though out of Tropic of Cancer, which is how it starts. He says, "I'm living at the Villa Borghese. There is not a crumb of dirt anywhere, nor a chair misplaced. We are all alone here, and we are dead. Last night, Boris discovered that he was lousy. I had to shave his armpits, and even then the itching didn't stop. How can one get lousy in a beautiful place like this? But no matter, we might never have known each other so intimately, Boris and I, had it not been for the lice. Boris has just given me a summary of his views. He is a weather prophet. The weather will continue bad, he says. There will be more calamities, more death, more despair. Not the slightest indication of a change anywhere. The cancer of time is eating us away. Our heroes have killed themselves, or are killing themselves. The hero then is not time, but timelessness. We must get into step, a lockstep, toward the prison of death. There is no escape. The weather will not change. It is now the fall of my second year in Paris. I was sent here for a reason I have not yet been able to fathom. I have no money, no resources, no hopes. I'm the happiest man alive." And then at the end of that paragraph, he says, "To sing, you must first open your mouth. You must have a pair of lungs and a little knowledge of music. It is not necessary to have an accordion or a guitar. The essential thing is to want to sing. This then is a song I am singing. How many of you have read Tropic of Cancer? The song that he was singing, yeah. So not very many. How many of you have started to read Tropic of Cancer? Yeah. That's the difficulty with Henry, that he's not narrative in the sort of John Steinbeck way. Yes?
Who published the first, the American edition of the book?
It was Jack Kahane is the publisher, and the name of the publishing company is Grove Press in New York. Yeah. And he took a big risk at the time and actually went to trial, and then finally it got released for everyone to read. It had been preceded by Lady Chatterley's Lover, for instance, had also gotten released just before. And in fact, Tropic of Cancer didn't get its own Supreme Court decision. It was like a certiorari, whatever it's called. It's like added to another case in the Supreme Court, so it never got its own name of a case. But it's definitely one of the big cases in 1964 and in the Supreme Court. Yes, D.H. Lawrence and Miller, yeah, they met, yeah. No, yeah. Henry has, copious amounts of letters. It's an amazing undertaking to try to publish and sort out all his letters. The ones between him and Florence Durrell is only about like 1/30th of the correspondence is published. So he is a prolific letter writer. We don't do that anymore, do we? How many of you wrote a letter in the last week? Ah, that was email. No? Okay. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. Did he ever have a relationship with Edward Weston or Karis Wilson?
That's a very good question. I don't think so, no.
And then he finally did leave Big Sur, correct?
Yes.
Where did he go and why?
He went back to Pacific Palisades, down to Pacific Palisades, to Lepska, to his ex-wife. And Tony and Valentine, his children, lived down there. So we actually moved back to the house, and in fact for a little while they lived there together in separate parts of the house. And then it ended up being Henry's house when Lepska moved with her new husband away. So he lived in Pacific Palisades for the rest of his life down there.
You asked earlier about preconceived notions.
Yeah.
I always had the impression there was a lot of drinking going on. Was drinking a big part of his life?
It's a good question. In fact, as far as Henry goes, no, not at all. He sort of contrary to people's maybe preconceived notion, thinking that he was some sort of like party guy that was carousing all the time and having big parties. I'd say not at all. In fact, he was so concerned about being on the top of his game that he wouldn't want to sort of destroy the next day by drinking too much tonight. So he was very measured, only because he had this sort of internal drive of needing to be productive in his output, whether it was writing letters to friends or continuing to write on the project that he was currently on. So yeah, not him, not Henry himself. A lot of his neighbors, his wife, drank herself. Maybe you could say that she would be because of alcohol that she died. It's not Lepska, but it's the wife after her. So yeah.
Magnus, tell me about ping pong.
Yeah, there you go.
Ping pong.
Bassett family.
Pardon me?
Bassett family.
Yeah. You mean Henry's ping pong?
Henry and Bill Bassett.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I know is that Henry wakes up is very concerned about his idea that he is going to go over to. You can tell the story better than I probably, because I don't quite remember if I think it's Henry saying to Bill that I'm going to come over and trounce you at ping pong, and it's late at night, and Bill says, okay then, come over and play. and Bill Fassett actually beats him in paintball that night. That's the only thing I know really about the story. Did I miss it?
No, but I think they did it a number of times with light signals.
Ah.
Washington Ridge to...
Over to maybe so, yeah. I've never heard that one.
Do you know how he met Eve?
Oh God, I'm trying to think. It's true Bezalel Schatz. Eve's sister is married to Bezalel Schatz, who is a Palestinian or Israeli artist that Henry knows through a vernissage in San Francisco. So it's the sister of Louise is her name. So it's through Bezalel Schatz and Louise that Henry meets Louise's sister, Eve. And that's how that happens. So they had an exhibit in San Francisco in 1944, and then in 47, and then in 48, I think is the year that he meets for the first time Eve. Who would then long later become his wife after Levska.
He also painted. Is that a hobby, or when did that start?
Henry always painted his whole life.
Was he a very engaged father?
Was he?
Yeah, was he close with his children?
Yes and no. I obviously don't know. I can only read between the lines and read a few things. But I think the answer is that he. Yeah, by today's standards, I don't think that he was really with them that much. If he was busy, he didn't. He was busy, and he did his writing. But I know that Valentine would probably throw a big rotten apple on my face if I say that. So maybe I'll take it back, considering not the fear of the apple, but now that I'm considering it really seriously, I'm thinking that having heard Valentine talk about her father with in such extraordinary loving terms, I can maybe interpret that as him really having been present more than maybe other things would indicate. But I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
What happened with his sister?
Loretta, she died here at the Pacific Grove in a care facility where she was for the last few years of her life. I think that was 67, 68, something like that. Yeah.
Can you talk about his education throughout his life, or as a child, or I don't know if he has essays on the subject?
Henry? No, he doesn't.
What school did he have?
High school, and he basically quit after high school. But went to Cornell for a short time, and was it? I'm actually a little insecure when I'm trying to answer that. I'm not sure if he his high school. He did go to university for a short time, but ended up leaving and actually coming to California as a young man. So he never had any. He never graduated from anything post high school.
He came to California before you?
Yeah. He worked at the ranch hand down in Southern California, and actually met Emma Goldman at a rally down in Southern California at the time.
What are your future plans for the library?
I think we have a motto at the library, basically I'm hoping that the library can arrive at a place where nothing happens. So the library is just sort of like a place along the road for like a little break from everything else, from everything out there in the real world. Solace from all the stresses and the demands from the world. That's kind of what I would like the library to eventually become. A place where nothing happens. Whether that ever is going to happen now, it's sort of like the opposite in a way, because we do have a lot of things happening at the library. But yeah, that's sort of what I would like. Yes, sir.
Did he meet or have correspondence with Burroughs, Ginsberg, Corso, Kerouac?
Henry had correspondence and some relationship with Jack Kerouac. He wrote the foreword to The Subterranean, for instance. But he didn't have a relationship with any of those guys. No. Nothing that he writes about or that they write about. They both appreciated one another's work very much, but none of them became friends. I mean, the folklore has it that Jack Kerouac tried to come down to Big Sur to meet Henry, but he got so completely drunk that he never made it very far, and it kind of fell apart halfway. Something like that. That's the story.
His time here overlaps with the time when Robinson Jeffers was active. Did they meet at all? Was there any interaction between them?
No. I have heard stories, and I'm sure there is someone in this illustrious audience that could help me along about this one. But I have heard stories of Uma having had Henry present with Henry Miller in the vicinity, and that Robinson had made some very, very strong, condescending remark about this man, Henry Miller. And so that ended that relationship potential. I think. Something like that. It doesn't sound completely out of the question, does it? No. I'm not sure if they had I know that Henry definitely admired Jeffers.
So they knew about it.
Yeah.
Should we just have one more question, two more questions?
Come on.
What was his relationship with the Knives Men? How did that progress?
They met, in Paris in the early 30s. She was married all this time and had an affair with Henry, and she had affairs with many people during the time of her marriage and throughout her life. They remained friends. They met in New York when she had a relationship with Otto Rank, the psychoanalyst. So they met in New York in the early 40s. And then they were somewhat estranged for a while, and she came to Big Sur in the 50s and visited him at the house there. Then Anais dies in 1977 down in Los Angeles, and they definitely had a relationship then and correspondence and talked to each other. So she was instrumental. She had huge impact on Henry. And she was also instrumental in having Tropic of Cancer being published, which was sort of a very material support for him. But does that answer your question? Yeah.
So how were you meeting with D.H. Lawrence? It was only once? Because I know he was a huge admirer of Lawrence and wrote about Lawrence and Lawrence's work.
I don't recall, but I know that Henry went to Taos. So I think, yeah. But I don't recall exactly how much or how many times he had met him, or... Yes, sir?
Magnus, speaking of Anais Nin and material support, tell us about your windfall, and is the redwood all sold now?
The redwood on the property right now? Yeah, there was on December 2nd, this last December 2nd, I drove to town in the morning. I don't know what I had to do in town, but maybe just a regular town run. And my friend who works at the library, he was walking up towards Nepenthe, which is just north of the library, and I drove by and I waved at him as I drove by. Then when I came to town, about 11 o'clock, my cell phone rings, and there's somebody and Michael is on the other line, and he says, something really drastic has happened at the library. The big redwood fell. And in fact, I don't know how many of you have been to the library recently, since December 2nd, but a very, very significantly big 9-foot diameter at the base redwood fell on the property, and fell exactly to the south, as it were, and it crossed the fence, took a power pole with it, and didn't cross the highway, but kind of fell along the highway up the hill to the south, and laid itself like a huge beached whale on the property. And I thought, wow, why did it fall? And it fell because it kind of grew out of its own willingness to seek the light. This redwood had grown for 500 years in a curve going up like this. So it had a very distinct curve to it. And basically the curve and the weight of the tree at the top became too much for its own good. So it just suddenly one day fell. And Mike, who works at the library, had come back from his morning walk and was actually at the library when the tree fell. And he said it was like this glacial, he used the word glacial, and by saying glacial he means it seemed to fall so slowly. This huge tree just like laid itself down almost graciously on the ground, crashing everything in its way. And that happened on December 3rd. And we have been harvesting this tree, and it turns out that the interior of this particular redwood tree is some of the most beautiful wood that you have ever seen. And I have been living in Big Sur for 30 years, and I live myself on Partington Ridge, very close incidentally to where Henry lived, and I have many, many, many large redwood trees on my own property, some of which have fallen in winter storms, some of which I have harvested myself. So I know a little bit of what I'm talking about when I say that the wood in this particular redwood tree is something absolutely extraordinary. In other words, the pattern of the wood, the life in this redwood tree is exquisite. It's such a beautiful tree. We have, since it fell, harvested the tree. So we've cut it up into slabs that are 12 foot long and 3 foot in diameter, that are now in a kiln in San Luis Obispo to be kiln dried so that they can be utilized for someone in someone's home or so. So that happened in December. And you guys know about redwoods obviously, but it's something else when they land in your front yard.
Can you just tell them we could use some financial support?
Oh, yeah. The Henry Miller Library is a non-profit 501c3 organization. And in fact, we always solicit for money, of course, because what we do, you know what, I actually really believe that what we do is a good thing. We have so many people from all over the world come into the Henry Miller Library and enjoy that place and enjoy the literature, and not just Henry Miller, but we also have many other things in the library that pertains to the local environment and region, our literary history. So it's a worthy cause, and we have, the only way we make money really is through the book sales and the events that we put on, and then we have people who donate to us in like our regular fundraising mail-outs. So I suppose that's what I'm saying now, is that if you feel compelled, so compelled, then please visit us on the Henry Miller Library website. It's henrymiller.org, simple as that. And there you can also find out about upcoming events, which we, until we arrive at the moment where we don't have to do events, we are still then doing those events. And that's all very good, in fact. And I think you would probably enjoy several of the events that are coming up this summer. It's pretty wide variety of things that we offer down there in our little oasis along Highway 1.